Guruve Gaura Chanjaya Radhikaya Tadare Krishnaya Krishna Bhaktaya Tada Bhaktaya Namo Namaha Vancha Kalpatrubhyascha Kripa Sindhubhaivacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Jaya Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shivasari Gaura Bhaktavinda Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Dandavat Pranam, devotees. So, I don't see the devotees on yet, but some devotees wrote to me asking two questions. And one question, I felt that there was already a video that I had done some years ago about the nature of love, and I thought that that video would be suitable to answer the question, so I posted that video earlier. And this video is dealing with, as the title suggests, the second part of a question, which was about gender, sex, the practice of bhakti, and progressive and archaic views on that. So the first part of the title I put myself because I wanted to speak to some degree about the factors of social engineering in how we perceive these things. So of course, recently it seems more so, there has been an upsurge of quote, progressive versus archaic views on many different elements of the practice of bhakti, with the idea being that there are some, quote again, archaic views that may not be substantive in terms of their ability to really help people come on the path of bhakti, maintain practice on the path of bhakti, and ultimately bring them to their success in bhakti. Whereas more progressive views on some of these issues, which are part of not only those who are trying to practice bhakti, but in the larger social fabric, more progressive views about these things will help perhaps to not only encourage, but nourish those who may be in a particular category of one of these dynamics, whether it's gender issues, issues with sexuality or combination of the both, and so forth. So basically, the reason that I put the beginning of my title as the influence of social engineering in these regards is because a great deal of what has come about as the upsurge of quote progressive versus archaic views is actually in great part due to the fact that the Vaishnav Mandal as a whole has become more porous. In other words, it's less insulated. I'll give the experience related to our ISKCON society because many devotees have had that experience. Many devotees do not live in India, in Gaudiya Math, etc., etc. So within the ISKCON experience, anybody who goes back within the association with the society more than 20 or 30 years knows, especially if you go back 40 or 50 years, knows that a great part of the social dynamic at that time was living in the ashram with a very laid out schedule from Mangal Arati to Sundar Arati to hot milk and rest. So everything was very insulated. And the particular social dynamics, which may have been a big part of the external dealings, did not seep into the environment as much. Not to mention, during the time of the presence of our Srila Prabhupada, obviously the extreme Shakti of a general in Mahaprabhu's army of the nature of Srila Prabhupada warded off a lot of the seeping, so to speak, of the social dynamics from the external world. Of course, over the course of time, with the Samadhi Leela of Srila Prabhupada, with the shifts in the economic dynamics that did not always make it viable to live in the ashram or to take care of innumerable devotees living in an ashram, and devotees working outside and participating in the ashram, and just the whole everything contributing factors that made the fabric of the Vaishnava Mandal more porous, and particularly in our ISKCON society. Also, the nature of the growth of certain social dynamics based on social engineering. So what I mean by social dynamics is the things that we see in society. You can start from today and start to do a retrospective look at how certain things have grown in proportion to perhaps even 10 years ago. For instance, the sense of wanton violence has apparently grown even in 10 years. What to speak of 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. It's just now where random wanton violence is pretty much, people have become numb to it because it's just so prevalent. Similarly, many factors about particular to our subject, many factors around gender, sexuality have become very prominent in the social fabric. And none of these things, my point being, none of these things, whether it's wanton violence, whether it's gender and sex issues, whether it's, socio-political issues, whatever it might be, it's not coming out of a void, and it's not necessarily organic, but it actually has evolved from a socially engineered dynamic. In other words, there are people in influence and power who set up a model of what they feel the social fabric should be like universally, and put into motion various kinds of programs and agendas to accomplish that. And then there are byproducts that offshoot from that agenda that produce many of the things that we see. So if it's not directly part of the agenda, then it's at least a byproduct of the agenda. Give me a second, because I'm multitasking here. All right, it's always around the same time that I'm starting to prepare things for Thakurji's lunch offering. So, because the particular social engineering and the dynamics that have come from it produce these particular topics we're talking about and have a certain sway and influence in how they're presented in the overall social fabric, because our Vaishnava Mandal is now more porous, those things seep into the Vaishnava Mandal and begin to take footing. So then you get a apparent, I'm not saying it's an actual, but an apparent dichotomy between perhaps the view of these things from the angle of vision that was given to us in Guru Parampara by our Srila Prabhupada, by our acharyas, and those views apparently in relation to devotees who have now had various kinds of experiences, all of us, not some devotees, but everybody going through the unfoldment of the years from that time, start to create a apparent dichotomy, as I said, of progressive views regarding these topics and, quote, archaic views, meaning what we may have gleaned or understood or practiced or directly were instructed from our Guru Parampara. So now, if you look in the Vaishnava Mandal, this sort of dichotomy appears to be growing. Progressive versus archaic views on these things. So, but in many cases, the dichotomy has arisen from an absence of any exchanged conversations from both angles of vision, and it appears that the different views have settled into comfort zones on either side of the discussion and have simply nourished their own views. So in other words, Those who, quote, have progressive views, they tend to group together and reaffirm and nourish that view. Those who have more archaic views seem to stay in a certain place and nourish those views. So in this way, really, I've not seen, anyway, many open discussions of reconciliation or how to reconcile these two views. In general, a lot of times we quote archaic view, and I keep quoting because I don't really believe these things are there. I think it's a lot of personal dynamics, and those personal dynamics aligning someone with a particular perspective and, you know, sort of taking that perspective and running with it and attaching it to the practice of Bhakti. And same thing, in the quote archaic view, someone aligning with, well, this is the tradition, this is the real thing, and aligning with it and running with it. So in the absence of that cross discussion, right, to get at commonalities, certain maybe misperceptions and so forth, it remains in that divisive state. Now, again, another big part of contemporary social engineering is division. It means to divide people on the basis of race, sex, sexual orientation, and any number of other ways they can find to divide people. Because obviously, if your agenda is inclusive of control, then it's easier to control pockets of the society than it is to try to control a large body of the society. And what will create a large body of the society would be a common interest, right? That's why there's such a pushback against, quote, religion at this point, because religion is one of those absolutely unifying factors when you look at it genuinely, that there is a God and that we're all servants of God is pretty universal to all religions. So you could just imagine if all the religious faith-based persons came together under that ideal, right? That would be a more difficult group to control, especially because of the ideal of God as the absolute truth. Because a whole big part of social engineering is to make everything relative. Because you cannot have different people divided into different groups if there's in fact an absolute truth. You understand? Because people will, organically want, well, what's my relationship to the absolute truth? But if you can make truth relative, then people feel comfortable in wherever they are in their perspective, because everything is relative, right? And extreme versions of this relativity are also being more or less pushed in the social fabric at this time. Extreme relativity. In other words, the idea that certainly God is relative, certainly, right? You can believe in God, but it doesn't demand somebody else has to believe in God. Therefore, all of the moral fabric, the natural, organic, spiritual inclinations in human beings, all of that is really relative. And as soon as you put things on a relative platform, it means it's up for debate, discussion, which especially in the fact that debate and discussion really doesn't go on a lot, only argument, right? It puts people in a place where the material influences that come into their life can hold sway because everything is relative. So if in my material influence comes a desire to act in a certain way, well, there is no absolute standard of anything because there's no absolute truth. You understand? So it weakens the ability of people to deal with material influences, because any influence they get, they can validate it by the fact that, relatively speaking, right, we can't say it's right or wrong because there is no absolute standard. There's no absolute anything. So a big tool of social engineering is relativizing everything. So in our particular topics under discussion here, gender and sex and so forth, that has been the particular thing that's happened. That really there's no true discussion on what creates the particular sexuality or particular mindset of somebody in regards to sexuality. That hasn't really been discussed from a perspective of true spiritual teachings. Because you get some spiritual organizations or faith bases, And in the general conception of that faith base, anything that does not align with just what is the base teaching must be a deviation. Just axiomatically, it's a deviation. If it doesn't line up with this, it's a deviation. And the natural pushback against that from those who are absorbed in relativity is, no, I can have my own truth. You actually hear this. This is my truth. So there's not a question of an absolute truth, but this is my truth. So first, let me perhaps, so it doesn't get so splayed out, let me kind of give a Bhakti perspective on these things, and then we have a baseline to work from. So one, what is it that creates the particular sexuality, particular mindset around sexuality in someone? It is absolutely and completely karma. Is there any proof of this, Mukunda? It's quoted directly in Srimad Bhagavatam, 3rd canto. Karmana dhaivana natrena jantu devapakye. I believe this is in the teachings of Kapila Dev to Devahuti, describing that actually karmana dhaivana natrena, that actually karma becomes the platform of destiny for any particular jiva moving from one life to another. So what is in that karma? Karma means a combination of desire and activities done in the past that produce a unique karmic package in the next life. In that life also, the impressions from that previous life as well as impressions from the current life come together and shape a karmic portfolio. So let me say it again. So the particular activities and desires from a previous life, they shape a particular karmic package for the next iteration or your next life. When you come into that next life, you also pick up impressions from that current life, and together those things create a karmic portfolio. In your karmic portfolio is the material impressions from the previous life and from the life that you're currently living. Now, for those who are practicing bhakti, because our particular reference is to these things in relation to bhakti, there's also bhakti sanskars. Praptanakar aduniki chasti yasad bhakti vasana. Many persons who are coming to the practice of bhakti are doing so because of impressions of practicing bhakti in a previous life and having not reached perfection. So there's a combination now of material impressions from the past life and bhakti impressions from the previous life and bhakti impressions and material impressions garnered in this life. So when those two things come together, normally they stay on their separate tracks, right? Because spiritual and material, they do not mix. Right now I'm hearing a lot of philosophical attempts, I'll say, to try to merge the two things. But clearly, even in Bhagavad Gita, it's mentioned, Bhumiyapona lovayu kamana burevacha aham karmityame bina prakriti ashtara. Krishna is saying that there are my 8 separated material energies. And apariyamidastuanyam prakritim vidimeparam jiva bhutamaha baho yayedam dayate jagat. Similarly, there is another apara shakti of mine. They are called jiva shakti. These jiva shakti and the material energy, they do not have any direct association. The association of the jiva or the atma with the material energy is a vicarious one, not an actual one. This is stated in Upanishad, asanga hi anyam purusha, that the purush, asanga, has no sangha with the material energy. So the complete relationship is vicarious. So that's one thing. So it is not illogical that when we awaken due to impressions from our bhakti samskars and begin to pick up the practice of bhakti, they apparently seem to be running on 2 different tracks. The jiva, before they're able to accomplish a synthesis, which is in our perfectional stage, there's a synthesis of the atma, because the atma or the soul is realized with the spiritual energy completely. And you can see this in one verse in Srimad Bhagavatam, first canto, I believe it's chapter 6 or 5, in Narada's Samvad, or Narada's conversation with Vyas. And he's explaining how he became perfect, and in his perfection, Prayujamani Mai Tuam Sudim Bhagavatim Tanu. Parabda Karma Nevano, Anyat Patat Panchabodhika. That when he became perfected, Prayuj, by the mercy of Bhagavan, Prayuj. Prayuj means a complete synthesis. A taratmic relationship means one relationship between the soul and Swarup Shakti. Because the Atma and Swarup Shakti, they are compatible in a way that the soul can become exactly, completely one with the Swarup Shakti. But that same soul can never become earth, water, fire, air, and ether, mind, intelligence, and false ego. It can have a vicarious relationship through the chitta with those things, but it can never become one with those things. Therefore, a temporal appearance of association vicariously comes about for so many years, then that body leaves and another body comes according to karma. So there are two tracks. This is my point. There are two tracks. One of material impressions and one of our bhakti impressions. Acquired from a previous life and those coming within this life. So according to the leaning of the chitta, the consciousness, in this life, the particular influences of the spiritual energy or material energy become more or less prominent. While we're in our unfolding stage, sometimes there is these, like if you had a railroad track. I described this the other day in my Zoom class. If you have railroad tracks, normally they're running parallel to each other. But every now and then, in order to make the train change directions, you can look and you'll see an intersection of the tracks. Right? That intersection of the tracks is not a permanent layout of the track system. It's a quick crossing to allow the train to change directions and go right back onto the two-track system. What happens in the unfolding process of a devotee is that there are times when the material influences and the spiritual influences, not the nature's touch, but their influences, their prabhav, crosses. And it's at those junctures that sometimes a lot of confusion comes. Because while I'm having impressions regarding my eternal real identity, my spiritual reality, there are impressions coming from the material side regarding my karmic influences, and sometimes that creates that cross-section. The problem is, the analogy I was giving is only to show that the cross-section happens and it's not permanent. The actual effect of that cross-section is that devotees hit a juncture of sort of emotional confusion, psychological confusion, because there's an attempt there to reconcile how the spiritual and the material, how are they going to fit together. That's what happens. In that juncture, people are trying to synthesize the spiritual and the material, and they don't actually ever become one. So a sense of void, a sense of unfulfillment happens in that juncture. So what happens is that in order to produce a sense of survival emotionally and mentally, a whole opening of different philosophical ideas presents itself, because this is the nature of the material energy. It rationalizes and gives reason to its existence. In other words, when those material impressions come in your heart, you may know, oh, this is not the right thing to do. This is pratikul to bhakti. But the material energy will rationalize, yeah, but, you know, it's not easy to do these things. Come on, everybody's doing these. Everybody's having this difficulty. Or it's not really meant that in the Kali Yuga, for a person who's in a particular cultural path, like a Western person, to be able to live like this or that. So all these rationales and reasons come so that the material influence can nurture and perpetuate itself. You understand? In a similar way, the spiritual impressions come, and it's the spiritual impressions that say, no, this is pratikul to bhakti. That this thing has the detrimental effect of covering the true nature of your progress in bhakti. or it's an aparad, or it's a deviation. So spiritual impressions are saying that. But in that state, because the material impressions may become strong at a certain point, then rationale and reason comes. But because we have spiritual impressions, we can't give them up. We try to find a way to synthesize them. And that's where you start getting ideas that are called, quote, progressive. Now, I don't want to just shine a light in that direction. If you turn around and shine the light in the other direction, in, quote, archaic views, what you have are people who also may not be able to completely reconcile why certain things in terms of, you know, different kinds of, let's say, sexuality, because this is our topic, gender or sexuality may be present. They cannot rationalize it, so they put it into the category of a deviation, and they don't investigate it any further than that. It's simply a deviation, boss, TK, that's it. It's a deviation. It's against Bhakti, finished, done. And that degree of closed door, closed mind allows a certain sense of security in their own state of unfoldment. It's not necessarily super mature, and it's not based necessarily in any true realization of what's happening, but it's a sense of security. I heard this is our Guru Parampara, boss. That's it. I don't need anything else. So now I want to give that reconciling point. So if we understand what I mentioned earlier, that every person, their life space is a combination of their material and spiritual influences from the past life and from this life, it is very possible that in a previous life, due to the nature of their activities, they are born in this life with an objective expression, let's say objective expression of a female body, but they identify as being male. That's karma. That is a karmic impression coming from a previous life and may be supported and nourished by activities in this life. So it's not a question here of right, wrong, etc., etc. It is a question of this is their karma. Similarly, a person who has a male body and identifies as a male, subjectively and objectively, that's their karmic arrangement. Because neither situation, the alternate identifications of having one kind of objective expression and a subjective experience, or having them be the same, both objective and subjective experiences are the same, both are products of karma, because both of them are not the actual Atma. Neither one of those are actually the Atma. So therefore, in that regard, neither situation is actually the self. Now, in regards, however, to the practice of bhakti, because the title here is these things in relation to the practice of bhakti and how to view it, quote, progressively or quote, archaically. So here, archaically, that's not a word. Archaic, I'll just stick with that, right? So here is the situation. If you understand that this is karma, as quoted in the third canto Srimad Bhagavatam, then that person's subjective and objective experiences is irrelevant in the sense that we know that's not the soul. That is a karmic expression. Similarly, I will not take a self-righteous stance because even if my subjective and objective experiences align, so to speak, it's still a karmic presentation and does not warrant a self-righteousness about it being right or wrong in comparison to that person's objective and subjective experience. Now, here's where we have to take a little bit of a more close look at how that relates to bhakti, however. The basis of bhakti is stated by Rupa Goswami Pad. Anya abhilasita sunyam jnana karmadi anavritam anukulyena Krishna anusilanam bhaktirutam. Service to Krishna means anya abhilas sunya. And the suffix ita is a special thing that describes extraordinary circumstances under which gender identification, how your sexuality is not one of those considerations. You understand? Heterosexual or any other kind of sexuality. That's not in that suffix ita, right? So anya abilas, there should be no other desire nourished in relation to practice of pure bhakti except the anukul seva of Sri Krishna. And all silanam means, silanam, the dhatu, the verbal root of that is seal. Seal means endeavors. All endeavors by body, mind, and moods should be towards the anukul seva of Krishna. So what it means is, anya abilas sunya would mean there should be no self-interest. The only interest should be that of the anukul seva of Krishna. Therefore, contemplation of my karmic circumstance, my material circumstance, I will have to see if it is anukul or pratikul to the seva of Krishna. Because now we're giving all of these things in relation to a metric of how it is bhakti or not bhakti. So now we're going to look to see if whatever karmic position I'm in, can I identify that karmic position as favorable or unfavorable to the seva of Krishna? Now, if I'm in a situation where my objective and subjective experiences are different, then I have to think, how will I be able to serve Krishna based on this posture? Based on that posture, there is no blockage to you serving to realize the Atma and become perfect. None at all. Where it becomes pratikul is when you want to exercise dharmic activity in the realm of marriage and so forth and so on. Now there is an issue. Because the essential feature of dharmic marriage, which Krishna speaks about in Bhagavad Gita, Dharma virureshu kamosmi bhatashava. I am that desire which is not contrary to religious principle. So now we have to look at Dharma Shastra. And in Dharma Shastra, there is recommendation that to be married means that the subjective and objective presentation of the two people has to be aligned with karmically what it is. In other words, a man and a woman, they are suitable to come together in dharmic marriage because a man and a woman, whether they can or not. Here the issue is not ability. Here the issue is what's inherent in the nature of being man and woman. They can come together and a service to Bhagavan in the form of procreation can take place. You understand? So in that dharmic arrangement, a service can take place, which will facilitate souls coming into the world who can then carry out their karmic and bhakti samskars and perhaps reach perfection. And more than likely, according to Bhagavad Gita, if a person was unsuccessful in a previous life, they generally will take birth in a wealthy family, or it says a family of devotees. Therefore, especially for those practicing bhakti, that service of procreating gives facility to souls to come into the world in the environment of bhakti, which is indicative that their previous bhakti samskars were pretty high. So there is a service that can be done there. You understand? In the situation in which the objective and subjective presentations are not aligned, so to speak, that somebody has the male objective presentation and a female subjective experience, then if you get with another person who has a similar experience, right, you may not be able to produce children, obviously. You cannot. And therefore, there's no scope for service under dharmic arrangement. So it has nothing to do with the ability of your position being untenable to attain Krishna consciousness, because there's no blockage to obtaining Krishna consciousness. But in terms of doing a service within the category of marriage and dealing with the sexual energy, there is not a scope of service there. Now, some people also, and this is just a nuance, within a situation in which the objective and subjective presentations are all aligned and, quote, they're heterosexual, both persons, and they come together and they are duly married. Well, Dharma Shastra says it is still considered to even be celibacy for husband and wife who are duly married to be able to engage in intimacy. It gives gradations to that. It says that those who will only practice intimate dealings, don't practice intimate dealings according to any outline, that is the lowest class of the Grihastha ashram. Those who practice intimacy but honor titis like Ekadasi and other holy days and abstain accordingly, that is one grade up. Those who have intimacy only when the time is viable for procreation, whether it happens or not, that is the third iteration. The fourth and highest class of intimacy in a heterosexual dharmic marriage is intentional desire to produce progeny. Therefore, our Srila Prabhupada, because it was in pursuance of Bhakti, mentioned sex life is only for procreation. He was not naive or not thinking that people who came from a background of all kinds of sexual habits, that they would not have, situations where they would struggle to come to that standard. But he set that standard because that's the standard that is anukul to Bhakti. It wasn't that Prabhupada didn't know Dharma Shastra. My Guru Parapadmas quoted Dharma Shastra, but still quoted the reason for intimacy with husband and wife is for procreation. Because this is anukul to Bhakti. So everything is based around what is anukulyena Krishna anusilanam, all endeavors for the favorable service of Krishna. It means the absence of self-interest. And in the other three categories of dharmic marriage and intimacy, there is self-interest. There is self-interest. It's really about my pleasure, and it's not necessarily intended towards a savor to Krishna. Right? Just like eating in food that's not really prepared and offered to Takaji, all these kind of things, we don't do it, but if devotees eat in a restaurant or something like that, it is not necessarily anukul because there's some self-interest involved there. You understand? So this is the point. So this is not meant to be critical or so forth and so on. I'm just pointing out how to see these things from a Sastric point of view, and perhaps coming together to discuss these things, it now becomes more clear what is what in these dealings. You understand? So because there is no scope for service in a situation in which the objective and subjective presentations karmically are not aligned, so to speak, then there's no scope for rendering the service of procreation. Therefore, any dealings in sexual activity will naturally be of self-interest. Similarly, in heterosexual relationships that are in those lower three categories, or they're adharmic if they're outside of marriage. If they're within dharmic marriage, then the first three, which is unrestricted, restricted by observance of various days like Ekadasi and so forth and so on, or the third level, which is at the time when procreation would be most viable, but your intention is still your self-enjoyment, right? All three of those are also not the best in relation to bhakti because they have self-interest. But the only one that's there that has no self-interest is the desire. And it's not that there won't be, so I don't want to get into the gritty details here, but if there's intention to do the service of procreating, then the dominant mood is that savor. And Baba Garhi Janardana, this is Krishna's nature, to accept the essence of something. But there's no essence of Anukul Seva in any other category of sexual dealing. That's just, it is what it is. That's just the reality. Right? Now, where we are in relation to that is our own unfoldment. That's just real. That's our own unfoldment. That a person may be in a position where they cannot practice celibacy. And if they're in that position, that's part of the unfoldment. And that's not something for community analysis and judgment. That's their individual unfoldment. And the person who will give insight, perspective, chastisement, or encouragement, or whatever it might be, will be Shri Guru. Shiksha Guru, Diksha Guru. They will give the outline of how to progress further, giving bhajan siksha with that particular status. Right? So it is not a question where it is a communal concern. And that's another thing that's become part of social engineering, is that they've made sexuality a public concern. That yes, it's everybody's business what your sexual orientation is and what kind of sexual orientation it is, and this and that, and then pitting one group of sexual experiences against another and so forth. This is all social engineering, and it's seeped into our Vaishnava Mandal and has become manifest as progressive and archaic views on the subject. No, they're only sastric views on the subject. And where we fit in those established sastric categories is our personal unfoldment. And it's not really the subject matter of communal approval, disapproval, etc. Of course, this is not inclusive of predatory behavior and misbehavior as far as sexuality is concerned and so forth. That obviously is a community concern. I'm speaking about a person's individual sexual situation, right? Of course, most importantly, we want to try to get to the point of identifying the soul. And in the soul, everyone is Prakriti. This is another thing which I've heard a little bit become, what should I say, corrupted or co-opted in the name of the rationale for some things. Prakriti and Purusha are not some that comes under the gender study category. Prakriti and Purusha are part of the energies and the relation of energies with the Atma and with Bhagavan. Every jiva is Prakriti, meaning they're of the nature of the energy of Bhagavan. And Bhagavan is Purush. Understand? Oh, Haribo Satin Siddhaprabhu. Yes, this one is live. Yeah, I'm speaking now. So, Bhagavan is Purush. And the jivas, all jivas are Prakriti, as well as all other energies are also Prakriti to Bhagavan. Because Bhagavan is the actual Keval Abhishai, means he's the only true enjoyer. And all other energies are enjoyed by Bhagavan. Understand? Alright, I have to attend to some things and I have some appointments, so I'm going to have to end this here. But hopefully this was helpful. I obviously may have to go through this discussion because I'm sure questions will be generated from it. And I tried to be as clear as possible and tried to cover these things. In terms of the other question that was asked, if you look at the other video that was posted today, it describes what is spiritual love and the difference between material concept of love and spiritual concept of love. Alright, my Dandavat Pranam. Vanchakalpatruvescha kripa shinduvevacha patitanam pavnebhyo vaishnavebhyo namo namaha. Jai Ram.